Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington. As public and private calls for President Biden to step aside after last week's debate performance are gaining momentum, with brutal new polling out this afternoon as the president and his White House allies feverishly work to salvage his candidacy and the remainder of his presidency. In just a few hours, President Biden is set to meet at the White House with Democratic governors. And it comes as sources tell me that the Biden campaign is now reaching out to conservative Democrats as part of an urgent effort to prevent defections within the party from snowballing. The president is also personally working the phones with a flurry of conversations with top Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, Jim Clyburn, and Chris Coons. And both Biden and Harris spoke directly to campaign staff this afternoon, with the president telling his team, "I'm not leaving, and no one is pushing me out." The full court press by Biden officials comes as more Democrats are publicly voicing their frustrations, while Texas Congressman Lloyd Doggett became the first Democratic lawmaker on Capitol Hill to call on Biden to withdraw, telling my colleague Hallie Jackson last night that voters in his district say the president needs to step aside.
I would say that the input from my constituents has been 10-1 in favor of replacing President Biden on the ticket. And then with the Supreme Court decision on Monday, we know that if a criminal and his gang take over the White House, there will be no checks and balances from the courts.
The White House has pushed back forcefully on calls for the president to step aside or suggestions that he won't run, even amid recognition that he must overcome Thursday's bad debate to be successful. Here's White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
Is President Biden considering stepping down?
Absolutely not. And you heard, I believe, directly from the campaign as well. It was not his best night. He understands that it is fair for people to ask that question. But we cannot forget his record and what he's been able to do. We cannot forget how he has been able to deliver for the American people for almost 4 years. That matters too.
Meanwhile, more signs of trouble in the polls. A post-debate New York Times Siena poll has President Biden's support eroding, with former President Trump holding a 9-point lead among registered voters. It's the first post-debate poll to show a gap outside the margin of error. That number tightens slightly to 6 points among likely voters, pushing it back within the margin of error, but just barely. And yet another poll out this afternoon from the Wall Street Journal shows a 6-point gap between Trump and Biden among registered voters, the widest lead for Trump in that poll since 2021. And we should note, 2 other surveys released this week show a much smaller margin, with Mr. Biden tied or slightly trailing Mr. Trump within the margin of error. And joining me now is Monica Alba at the White House. Sahil Kapur is on Capitol Hill, and also with me, Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent at the New York Times and an NBC News political analyst. Thank you all so much for joining us. And Monica, I do want to start with you. The president will meet with governors in just over 2 hours. What are we expecting from this meeting, and what are these Democratic governors looking to hear?
I think it's notable, Gabe, that several of these governors are coming to attend this meeting in person, and that's because it seems they want to hear directly from the president. They want to have this exchange so that they can assess for themselves what the president is saying in public now and in private to his own campaign staff about his poor debate performance. And so I think they want to be able to have that opportunity to ask some questions and to participate in this. And many of those governors expressed some concern in the initial days after the debate that they hadn't heard from the president. So this is also just an opportunity for them to be able to have that conversation and then also be able to go back to their states and to their constituents and try to maybe relay some of whatever the message may be from the president or from the vice president, which we got a clear window into earlier today from both the campaign call and then the call with the White House chief of staff. But I think, Gabe, there's really a recognition here that some of the president's own key allies privately have been saying that they have concerns about what they saw on the debate stage and that they really need to know that some of that can be addressed before they can make a larger comment or statement about what they think the president should do in the race. And we saw that similarly from some top congressional leadership as well. But the White House knows that the governors are really important, since they include, of course, some people who could be running for the Democratic ticket in the future. And that's a really big part of the backdrop to all of this as well.
Yeah, certainly. Monica, the president was pretty emphatic in his earlier campaign call. What do we know about how that was received among staff?
And look, I think it tells you a lot, Gabe, that they decided that it was important enough for the president and the vice president to join this call. They hadn't really communicated in that way with campaign staffers since the disastrous debate performance. So I think the fact that they did get on this and tried to really say in the plainest of terms, the president said, essentially, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving. No one is pushing me out. I am going to be committed to this. I'm going to be the nominee. And he said, I'm in this race to the end, and we're going to win. That is what he wanted to communicate. And the vice president, for her part, said, look, you guys know Joe Biden, and he has fought for you and for Americans for decades. And she essentially argued it's our turn, in her words, to now fight for him. So this unity image is something they really wanted to present today, because also the president and the vice president had lunch today at the White House, which is something they sometimes do, but notable that it happened today and that she's going to be with him tomorrow for the 4th of July celebration as well. So they're trying to really project this image of unity when behind the scenes we know there are a lot of really difficult and intense questions being raised. Gabe.
Yeah, Monica, the president is now telling supporters that his bad debate performance was because of jet lag. He said that in a fundraiser last night, but he did have more than 10 days, about 12 days to rest up before the debate once he got back to the U.S. How is the White House explaining that? I know the press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, was asked about that this afternoon.
Yeah, repeatedly, because when the president raised that last night, it was notable that he did so without teleprompters. So clearly that's something that he wanted to share from his own viewpoint, or maybe that's something he really believes, and that is why he told donors that. But when you do look at the calendar, he was able to return from Italy to Los Angeles, where he participated in a mega fundraiser with George Clooney and former President Obama. But then he was able to really dedicate the next 11 or 12 days or so to debate prep if he wanted to. There were other issues and there were other events that he dealt with. And of course, during the course of his day job as president, he had to deal with some of that incoming as well, the White House notes. But over and over again today, the press secretary tried to argue that there was jet lag from the overseas travel combined with a cold that came from it that really impacted his performance. But it does strain credulity, no doubt, Gabe, that could really be something that could take so long. But those were the president's own words, and he said that he nearly joked that he almost fell asleep on the debate stage as a result of that jet lag and that cold.
My colleague, Monica Alba, thank you so much for your reporting today. Monica, thanks so much. And Sahil, I want to turn to you. We know the president has now spoken to some top Democrats. What do we know about those conversations?
Yeah, that's right, Gabe. So here's what we do know. Just today, some 5 to 6 days after that shocking debate performance, President Biden has finally made contact with congressional leaders and has spoken to them today. And we know some names of the people he's spoken to. That includes Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. It includes House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's still very influential in the Democratic Party, and Congressman Jim Clyburn, a crucial figure in President Biden's ascent in that Democratic nomination in 2020. Now, our sources and subjects did not reveal the details of those conversations, but we can kind of gather a hint from how the campaign has been conveying to supporters what their position is in, calls with surrogates and talking points, including one memo that you obtained today. What they've been saying essentially is pointing to polls that don't show a huge change in the race. Of course, some polls do show a bigger change, statistically significant, like Wall Street Journal today, and other polls don't. They're focusing on ones that don't. They're also arguing that if polls do show some slippage in the foreseeable future, that would just be a moment in time. So there's a bit of a heads I win, tails you lose argument that they're making with regard to the polls. They're also talking about how their fundraising has been pretty spectacular, both on debate day, that they've outraised Trump in the month of June, and they insist that Biden is not going anywhere because if he does, it would be pure chaos. And it would, in one email that the Biden deputy campaign manager sent out to supporters, it would be, quote, the best way for Donald Trump to lose. So bottom line, they're insisting that Biden's staying in, that he's not going anywhere. And for the first time since that debate, Joe Biden, the famous schmoozer, is finally calling these key allies that he needs to keep on board.
Sahil, I want to talk to you about, first, you mentioned 5 or 6 days it took him to make some of these calls, including to Clyburn today. I'll get for your reaction on that, but we're just learning some breaking news here that the New York Times is reporting just within the past few moments that Congressman Raul Grijalva has become now the second member of Congress to ask for President Biden to step out of it, or to leave this race. You know, are the floodgates opening here?
Well, that certainly sounds significant, Gabe, given that he's following Lloyd Doggett. Grijalva represents a blue district in Arizona. He would be the second person, both of them now in blue districts, calling for Joe Biden to step aside. Grijalva is a former chair of at least a co-leader, I'd have to go back and look exactly what his title was, of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. So that is significant, but that by itself is not necessarily something that would cause the floodgates to open. I can think of several scenarios that would, put serious pressure on President Biden to consider stepping aside. That is if one of the four top congressional leaders that I just mentioned to you, he spoke to, if any of them were to call on him to step aside, that would be a big problem for him. If a series of frontline Democrats who are in competitive districts start to worry that Joe Biden at the top of the ticket is going to cost them their races and cost Democrats their shot at the House of Representatives, that would be a big problem because Democrats at the very least see the House as their best shot to flip, their best shot at a firewall against a hypothetical Donald Trump presidency. And of course, Joe Biden is a Senate guy. He spent 3.5 decades in that chamber. If a group of Democratic senators come out and say it's time for you to go, that would put a lot of pressure on Biden. I don't know that Grijalva coming out is necessarily a game changer, but it's certainly something to watch because the numbers are getting worse for him, not better.
Sahil Kapur, live for us on Capitol Hill. Sahil, thank you. I want to turn now to Peter Baker. And Peter, the other part of these discussions about the debate and Biden's fitness is how transparent the White House is being about his health. Now, you've reported that people who spend time with him say his lapses are becoming more common. So if the White House doesn't tackle this head on, are more of these lapses going to surface?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why Democrats are upset. There are a few reasons. One, the debate itself, but two, the sense that the White House may not have been completely forthcoming about the president's age and the condition he has been in. The idea that this would happen on last Thursday night and it would be a first-time aberration seems implausible to a lot of people, especially those who have seen him up close in recent weeks and months. Now, is that because of the jet lag? Is that because he was fatigued? That obviously could be a factor. Certainly, he thinks it is. He's saying it is. But that's, it's a problem for the White House because there is this sense that we don't have the full picture of where he is right now. And of course, we don't know where he's going to be, not just at the end of this year, but at the end of 2028, if he stays in for another 4 years.
And Peter, I want to play some of what Congresswoman, former House Speaker Pelosi and Congressman Clyburn told my colleague Andrea Mitchell yesterday. Let's listen.
Again, I'm not a doctor. I can't say what happens 3-4 years down the road. But I think that in my experience, which is what you asked me, I think that he will continue to be a great president of the United States.
I'll have to wait on the experts in medicine to give their opinion because I'm not a doctor, so I have no idea the extent to which all of this may have occurred. But when you are 81 years old, you are not as nimble as you are at 21.
And Peter, as someone that watches this so closely, what was your reaction when you heard that? The fact they didn't just dismiss it out of hand, was it a real shift from a couple days ago, even over the weekend? Does it reflect a real concern or perhaps an acknowledgement that this dismiss strategy just isn't working?
Yeah, I do think it does reflect a shift. I think you're right about that. They can't get away with completely dismissing it without aggravating some of their own Democrats. I mean, that's gone over badly. The attacks on what they call the bedwetting brigade, these are fellow Democrats who have expressed concern, has only, aggravated a lot of the people who otherwise are supportive of them and not really necessarily helped rally the party behind the president. So you're hearing from Pelosi and Clyburn and some of the others, support, but it's measured. And I think people recognize that they're listening to their constituents. And their constituents, by the way, include their fellow elected office holders. It's not just these two now who have come out and say that they think the president should step aside. There are others who are waiting in the wings who may, in fact, get there themselves for the reasons Sahil talked about earlier, because they're worried about the down ballot implications. And I think the reason it's been hard for Pelosi and Clyburn and a lot of these Democrats is because they actually do really care and respect and admire Joe Biden. And they don't want to kick him when he's down, but they see out there the threat of Donald Trump coming back, and everybody in the Democratic Party right now considers that to be their #1 priority.
So, Peter, last night at this off-camera fundraiser that Monica mentioned, the president blamed his recent travel for the poor debate performance. He said he, traveled shortly before the debate, even though it was more than 10 days before the debate. But he also joked that he almost fell asleep on stage. But if you remember, and I'm sure you do, the White House had been touting those same trips as proof of his youth and his vigor. What sense does that make? Is this just messy messaging?
Yeah, they've been using his travel schedule as a way to prove that he's not 81, and instead, of course, it's now turned out that it proved that he is 81, right? And in fact, that rather than make reasonable accommodations for a man depending on his age, as other politicians have done, Ronald Reagan, obviously, they made accommodations for when he was growing older himself in order to make sure he was at his peak. They seemed intent on showing that Biden could do everything that a 41-year-old could. And it's true, obviously, a lot of his own aides who are younger than he was and is were quite exhausted by that travel schedule. But you're right. Obviously, they gave him 2 days off when he got back to go to Delaware to kind of recover. And when they did the debate prep at Camp David, they started each day at 11 a.m. They made sure to carve out time in the afternoon for a nap. Those all may be perfectly reasonable, but it does make you wonder if that 23 days leading up to the debate where he had this travel schedule and then the debate prep was responsible for the way he was or an accelerant of what was already happening.
Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times. Peter, thank you. And let me now bring in Ben Wikler in the critical state of Wisconsin. He's the chairman of the Democratic Party there. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. And Wisconsin is a critical battleground. The president is heading there on Friday. I want to get your reaction to the president's debate performance last week. How concerned are you?
The debate was really tough. It was a really tough debate to watch. I got lots of phone calls and texts during the debate, after the debate. And then we saw him in North Carolina the next day, and it was the President Biden who gave the State of the Union address. We knocked on 31,000 doors over the weekend. We had more than 1,500 volunteers in motion in the state of Wisconsin, the tipping point state in both of the last two presidential elections. And when they went out and talked to voters, for undecided voters in this election, a lot of them already were aware of the president's age. A lot of them had not thought a lot about President Trump. And so they were pretty alarmed by what they saw from Trump. That's what we heard from voters on the ground here over the weekend. I think the key thing right now is that voters are going to see President Biden. They're going to see him come to Wisconsin this Friday. They're going to see him in Pennsylvania and in New Hampshire. They're going to see him in televised press interviews. President Biden is going to remind people exactly why they supported him in the primary and through these last 4 years. And he's going to remind them of the danger if Donald Trump gets back into office, which is really in plain sight planning a military dictatorship in this country. I think that is going to remind us all why the stakes are so high and why it's time to get focused on winning this election.
Ben, you mentioned that voters saw President Biden the day after the debate in North Carolina at that rally. He was very well received. I was there. However, he was also reading from a teleprompter, and he has been reading from a teleprompter in many of his events. Does he need to stop doing that? Does he need to get out there more?
President Biden does a mix of conversations. He does photo lines, talks to people one-to-one over and over. He does small fundraising events. He does big events. He does the big rallies with the teleprompter. This is a president who shows up in all kinds of different situations. And the through line is his fundamental decency and patriotism and honesty and conviction and love of his country. The through line is what we heard from the president in response to that Supreme Court ruling that said that a president has criminal immunity for any official act. We know that Trump wants to use that to exact revenge on his enemies, and we know President Biden would never do that and wants to defend the fundamental decency of this country. And those are the stakes in this election. I know that it's easy to get lost down a million rabbit holes in a moment like this. I also know that President Biden will always fight to expand freedom in this country, defend our democracy, and deliver for working people. And the same guy that walked the picket line and went to the war zone in Ukraine is the same president who's running for re-election right now. And that's why Democrats are organizing in battleground states to make sure that he wins this race.
Do you think President Biden is the only Democrat that can beat former President Trump this November?
President Trump is a terrible, terrible candidate. He was a terrible president, and Democrats should not underestimate the dark energies that he brings out in American politics. It's a frightening thing to watch. And right now he's posting on Truth Social that he wants military tribunals for his critics. So I think we need to throw everything we can at this. And we know that President Biden can beat Donald Trump because he did it before. Last time, it was during the COVID pandemic, and the Republicans kept organizing on the ground all the way through, while Democrats were just virtual. It was a close election. We won. This time, we're organizing with everything we've got. lot. We've got 48 offices in Wisconsin, and President Biden is visiting Wisconsin over and over again in a way that was impossible during the 2020 year. So I think he has every opportunity to beat Donald Trump if we all put in the work. And the number one focus that I have is to ensure that we bring about that outcome and save American democracy in this moment of crisis.
Ben, the Times Siena poll taken after the debate that we were referencing earlier in the program had 74% of respondents saying that the president is just too old to serve. Now, that debate had a big audience, so is it possible to change these people's minds with just roughly 4 months left in this race?
This was the earliest presidential debate in political history, I think, as long as I'm aware of, certainly in modern televised debate history. We have a long way to go. And what people want to see and will see from President Biden is the energy and vigor and focus that we saw in North Carolina, that we saw at the State of the Union address, and that I'm sure we'll see in Wisconsin this Friday. That helps remind people that President Biden has been knocking it out of the park when he's been counted out over and over again. And it will help draw folks' attention to the contrast between the kind of future that we'll experience in a Biden second term versus a Trump second term, when the gloves are off and his administration is staffed by people who are sworn loyalty to Donald Trump instead of to our Constitution.
Ben, before I let you go, we did hear from Senator Tammy Baldwin's campaign, and we've learned that she will not appear with President Biden on Friday when he visits. Now, she had a prearranged schedule, and the Biden campaign says that she'll be 100 miles away. But should she have made it a point to show up at that event with President Biden, perhaps have a show of unity?
Senator Baldwin is campaigning all over Wisconsin, in Madison. Governor Evers and myself and other officials are going to be there with the president. I want us to cover the ground across our state, something we're doing weekend after weekend. This last weekend, we had Wes Moore and Jim Clyburn in 2 different cities at the same time. We want to make sure voters everywhere are hearing from Democrats and the contrast between a vision of freedom and democracy and delivering for the middle class and MAGA extremism, abortion bans, and attempts to dismantle American democracy.
Ben Wikler, chairman of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, that critical battleground. Ben, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.